Hi everyone and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing It Came From the Network. The topic for this It Came From the Network, WWF King of the Ring 1998. The reason for this? I've seen a lot of videos, one specifically by WWE that came out talking about this event just passing its 25th year anniversary, and it has arguably one of the most famous matches in the history of wrestling on it. And to be perfectly honest, it's been a number of years since I went back and watched that match in its entirety. So I wanted to go back and revisit this historic event, see if that match in particular holds up, and you'll know when we get there. And also, how the rest of the card was, and if that all still holds up. If you haven't seen my shows before, I grade everything on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 is the worst, 5 is the best. With that being said, let's jump right into it. We start the show off with a match with the Headbangers, Mosh and Thrash teaming up with Taka Michinoku, going up against Kayenta, who at this point is Sho Funaki, Men's Teo, and Dick Togo. This was not that great of a match. I mean, in honesty, it was a little bit boring to me. And don't get me wrong, I like the Headbangers, I like Kayenta, I like Taka. I think they're all really good wrestlers. Just something here, I don't know if it's the timing, the style, but this just didn't work for me. The Headbangers and Taka pick up the win here. I'm giving this one a 2. I wouldn't recommend going back and watching it. To me, it was just a little bit off. That's followed up with an in-ring segment. We have Sable come out, who basically her whole job was to announce Vince McMahon to come out, who comes out with Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe. The funny thing about this, watching it back, and the same goes for a lot of the Attitude Era stuff, is what they got away with here. Like, as Sable's leaving the ring, Pat Patterson smacks her on the butt. And I know, it was probably agreed to, but something like that happening today would be totally no-go. There'd be no way you could get away with that. Just an interesting little segment. Basically, Vince McMahon is talking about how there's no way that Steve Austin's going to leave the show tonight as the world champion. He is in the main event against Kane in a First Blood match, which obviously the deck is stacked against Austin. Pretty cool little segment here. Always like seeing this era of Vince McMahon, especially with the Stooges. I think Patterson and Briscoe were so good as the lackeys that you almost forget that this is two of the greatest in-ring performers of all time standing next to this guy, and you look at them like they're Curly and Shemp from the Stooges. Just a cool little segment. That's followed up with our first of 2 semi-final matches for the King of the Ring tournament itself. We have Ken Shamrock going up against Double J Jeff Jarrett. The one thing that always stands out to me when we go back and watch things of this era is just how over Ken Shamrock was and how important to the company he was. But he's kind of one of those guys that's swept under the rug. Like, you hear a lot of talk about Mankind, Undertaker, Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, and rightfully so. They all deserve credit. DX, China. But you don't hear a lot of talk about how big of a player someone like Ken Shamrock was. He may not have been on that top tier level where he won a championship, or WWE championship specifically, but he was on that, like, B-class tier, and I know those guys are usually not the ones that we talk about, but if you look back, when we talk about the rock and wrestling era, we talk about Steamboat, we talk about Savage, we talk about Rick Rude, Mr. Perfect, all guys that within the WWE only were Intercontinental Champions. It's just funny to me how Shamrock isn't looked upon more favorably, more so is what I'm basically getting at here. This was a decent match. A lot of these don't hold up to today's standards, and it's kind of hard to grade them highly going back and watching them now. Shamrock does pick up the win here. I'm giving this match a 3. That's followed up by our second semi-final match. The winner is going to face Shamrock in the finals. We get The Rock going up against Dan the Beast Severn. This was interesting because it's obviously set to make you think maybe we'll get Shamrock versus Severn, a feud that was a UFC feud that carried over into WWE. And again, we have 2 guys here in The Rock and Ken Shamrock who are basically, they're up-and-coming stars at this point. Both had right under 2 years of experience in the WWE here. And you could see they're obviously 2 guys they're building their future on. This is a fun match. The Rock is in the Nation of Domination still here, so we get the assistance of D'Lo Brown coming out to hit his frog splash on Severn, who had injured him, and this is where the D'Lo chest protector era started, to basically help The Rock get the win here. Again, I thought this was a good match. not great. I'm giving it a 3 as well. That's followed up with a rather interesting match. We get Too Much, Brian Christopher and Scott Taylor. You may know them better as Too Cool. They're in a tag team match against Al Snow and Head. And the story of this is Al Snow and Head had recently tried to get back into WWE, and Jerry Lawler kind of was trying to help them along the way, but basically was using Al Snow. This is all said in a recap package. Trust me, my memory on Al Snow coming back wasn't that great. So the tag match is Al Snow tagging with Head. And surprise, surprise, much like a lot of things in the Attitude Era, we get a surprise deck being stacked against the face. Jerry Lawler is going to be the referee for the match. I enjoyed this match. It was a little bit goofy at times. Of course, the Head is not going to get involved. The Head is not going to wrestle. And I like watching Too Much because I do think, even though they went on to have great success as Too Cool, I think that they were a little bit underrated as Too Much. I've said it many times in my other videos where I cover Memphis wrestling, how much I enjoy Brian Christopher, especially this version of him. And maybe it's just a product of the Attitude Era that he didn't really get over until he was Too Cool or Grandmaster Sexay, but I did enjoy him, and I did think this was a fun team too. Ultimately, we see the end come where Christopher grabs the Head and kind of screws the Head onto a bottle of Head and Shoulders shampoo, so obviously Head and Shoulders, you can pin the shoulders to the mat, which I thought was kind of cool, a nice little touch. As he's doing that, Al Snow's pinning Scott Taylor, so they're both getting a simultaneous count. Although we get the pin, the hands get raised, and it's Too Much that wins, because Lawler obviously was trying to screw Al Snow. If Al Snow would have won, he would have got a contract. Just that little part made this a little bit better for me, made me more bearable, because the match itself was kind of stupid and silly. And there's a lot of this in the Attitude Era. I know we look back at the Attitude Era with rose-colored glasses, but there's more of this than there is of Stone Cold with a beer truck. The reason we don't remember this kind of stuff that's somewhat a miss is because while this was happening, we could flip over and see what the NWO was doing on WCW. So if there was something that wasn't great on WWE, you could choose to watch something on WCW. You might see something like Sting attacking Scott Hall at the same time. So you don't really remember these silly segments as much, or maybe you just block them out of your memory because we tend to remember the stuff that's really great or really bad. This doesn't fall in either. It just kind of feels middle of the road. Again, I'm probably sound like a broken record, but I'm giving this one a 3 as well. The end made it more entertaining than it seemed to be. I do think that Al Snow, Jerry Lawler, and Too Cool are all very creative, so that ending was very creative. It made it more enjoyable than probably the match should have been. That's followed up with probably my second favorite match on the card, XPac versus Owen Hart. At the time, Owen was affiliated with the Nation of Domination. I don't think he was officially in there. I may be wrong. I may have my timeline wrong. But he definitely was affiliated with them. This was the era where Owen was doing the enough is enough and it's time for a change. I really enjoy both these guys. I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it a million times over. Out of the Harts and the Hart relatives, Owen is probably my favorite of the bunch. I know Bret has more accolades, but I personally am drawn more to Owen Hart. I like his style better. I like his interviews. I like the fact that I think he's a better heel, even though Bret Hart in the 97 Hart Foundation was a fantastic heel. There's just something about Owen that I enjoy better. And even Davey Boy. I enjoy Davey Boy more than I enjoy Bret Hart. And that's not a knock on Bret. There's a lot of people that love Bret, and I definitely understand if you do. Just to me, out of the Hart clan, he's not my favorite. It's a really fun match. I enjoy the way these two work with each other. Of course, with it being the Attitude Era, we see Mark Henry getting involved, which also brings out Vader, which reminded me, oh yeah, there was a small little Vader and Mark Henry feud. X-Pac does pick up the win here. I'm giving this one a 4. I thought it was probably my second favorite match of the night, and it's going to be pretty obvious if you don't know the match that's on this card already. It'll be obvious when I get there which one's my favorite. That's followed up with a ring interview with Paul Bearer, and I'm going to talk about that match here because he brings it up. He comes out and basically says, I had to come back to WWE because I wouldn't miss this for the world. You have my son, Kane, who's going up against Austin for the World Championship, and then you have The Undertaker, who I hate, going up against Mankind in the Hell in a Cell match. Yes, it's that match that's coming up if you didn't know already. So this was cool seeing Paul Bearer out there. I mean, you always like seeing Paul Bearer. He's one of those guys that just has such a gimmick and such a great voice that made everything he touched a little bit better. I enjoyed seeing him out here. It was awesome seeing Paul again. That's followed up with a tag team match for the WWE Tag Championships, or WWF at the time. We get the New Age Outlaws, Billy Gunn and the Road Dogg, going up against the New Midnight Express, Bombastic Bob and Bodacious Bart with their manager Jim Cornette. The sad thing about the New Midnight Express is I think they would have worked as a tag team under any other name. The second you put that name, the New Midnight Express, compare them to one of the great tag teams of all time, whether it's Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton or Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane. Enough of the fan base at that time either grew up watching the Midnight Express or knew of the Midnight Express and were very fond of them. Bart Gunn and Bob Holly were not the Midnight Express, and that's not a knock on either. I think Bart Gunn did fantastic work as part of the Smoking Guns. I also liked his run in All Japan Pro Wrestling as well. Bob Holly I really like his Hardcore Holly stuff. I think he did really well in that. It kind of felt like they were trying to find a role for these guys that had been company men that were really good assets and great wrestlers, so they kind of threw them into this. I think if you package them exactly the same, give them a different name, keep them with Jim Cornette, you might have a great tag team of the other. Let Jim Cornette do the talking, let them be the badasses. It might be fun. Alas, it was not meant to be. The main thing in this match was seeing Billy and Bart going up against each other and them referencing them being brothers, which was pretty cool. I didn't remember that they referenced it much on television, even when we had them split, like during the Brawl for All time. I don't remember it being referenced much that Billy and Bart were brothers, so seeing it here was really cool that they acknowledged that. Obviously, the New Age Outlaws pick up the win here. Again, it's another just okay match, nothing great. I'm giving it a 3. Next up, we roll into the finals for the King of the Ring tournament. Ken Shamrock versus The Rock. I always enjoyed the matches with Shamrock and The Rock. I think they matched up well. Shamrock's intensity brought out a different side of The Rock, where he was more aggressive, more violent in their matches, where Rock's more entertaining side brought out more of that in Shamrock as well. I think these two were good foils for each other, especially at this point of their career. We have Triple H who's on commentary. We'll see him and The Rock get into a little bit of a back and forth during the match, which sets up SummerSlam, which I believe was the next pay-per-view after this. I'm pretty sure. I'm almost 100% sure, unless there was a In Your House that they slotted in there. This was probably the best of the King of the Ring matches that night, but still nothing great about it. Ultimately, Shamrock picks up the win here. I'm giving it a 3 again. It was good, but nothing really special. Next up, we get the match. I would say this is probably the most famous, or one of the top 5 most famous wrestling matches in all of wrestling history. You could say Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3. You could say Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker at WrestleMania, either one of their matches. You could say Hogan and The Rock at WrestleMania 18, or even Austin versus Bret Hart. This match, I really think, especially for it not being a WrestleMania match, it goes down in history as one of the most iconic matches, one of the greatest matches, one of the most violent matches. There's so many adjectives that you could add here that talk about this match, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the Hell in a Cell match with The Undertaker and Mick Foley at this time as Mankind, and this is just great. I mean, going back and watching this, even knowing what's going to happen, and 25 years later seeing much crazier things happen, the danger of this, the magnitude of it, the two guys themselves, Undertaker and Mankind, who had some great matches in the past, the Boiler Room Brawl, other matches that were really great leading into this. Just seeing what they did here and how this match was worked. They start the match on top of the cage, which I'm sure everybody knows. We're roughly 2 minutes into them fighting back and forth on the top when we see probably one of the most replayed videos in WWE history. We see The Undertaker grab Mankind and throw him off the cage, going through the Spanish announce table, and this was just insane. Watching it at the time, it was probably one of the most shocking things that you ever seen on wrestling, and legitimately, for a few moments, you had to question if Mick Foley was alive or not. When he goes through the table, he's half in the crowd under the guardrail, half laying there, and he's laying there motionless for quite a few moments. Jim Ross, who's absolutely legendary in this, I think Jim Ross added just as much as the wrestlers himself to this, because you could hear his concern concern. You could hear his excitement. You could hear everything about him. His anger. You could hear him be upset that Mick Foley, a guy that he's probably friends with, may be permanently injured, may have some serious damage. It's such an iconic call by Jim Ross that when you watch something like, let's say for instance, there's an NBA game and a team is winning by 40 points, you'll see a little highlight come up even to this day, 25 years later, with Jim Ross yelling, "Stop the goddamn match!" And I know it's a terrible Jim Ross impression. Or if you see an epic fall, like someone doing a skateboard trick and falling off the skateboard, you'll hear, "By God almighty, he's broken in half!" And it's just so great. It adds so much to this match, which even without that's iconic. Even if you watch it with no commentary, you could feel the audible grasp in the crowd when Foley goes off the cage. They raise up the cage with Undertaker still sitting on top of it to get the stretcher out there to take Mick Foley out, and most people believe at the time, okay, this is the end of the match. Foley is definitely injured. Vince McMahon is out there looking very concerned. Terry Funk, who we know is one of Mankind's best friends, is out there. They start taking him back on the stretcher, and we get about halfway up the ramp, and we see Mick Foley sit up. And I'm going back and forth between calling him Foley and Mankind, and I know I've seen this somewhere, and it was a perfect explanation of it. And it may have been Mick Foley himself that said it. When they take off the Mankind mask and he's Mick Foley, you transport the crowd into thinking this is just a character into this is a person. So yes, I'm going to interchange both of them here. I do apologize. Hopefully we all know that it's the same guy. So Foley steps up, starts coming back to the ring, which everybody is like crazy. Jim Ross is questioning what he's doing. You see him get to the cage. Undertaker's already climbed down on the other side. Foley decides to climb back up. Undertaker goes back up with him. They start fighting again on the cage, and from everything I've seen, and I tend to believe the people because it seems that every story corroborates it, they thought that the cage would break, but not as easily as it did. I've heard Mick Foley say he thought that it might take 3 or 4 choke slams to go through. We get the second fall, which Foley himself has said is the worst of the two. It may not be the most visually compelling, but it is the more dangerous and more damaging fall. Foley gets choke slammed through the cage. A chair falls down with him, hits him in the face, which breaks out some of his teeth. And again, they slow down and stop the match. The WWE doctors come back in. Vince is back in. Terry Funk is back in. And this was great on the mind of Terry Funk and The Undertaker, who climbed down in the cage too as well here. You see them stall for time, trying to figure out, can Mick Foley wrestle or is this the end? Famously, because they've all said it, Undertaker asks Terry Funk to check and see if Mick is still alive, which if you watch the match, you could see him touch Mick Foley's face. Well, he's not touching him just to confront him or console him. He's checking his pulse. They legitimately didn't know if Foley died from this, which was a clear danger. Funk confirms that he lived through this, takes a chokeslam from The Undertaker, which knocks him out of his shoes, which is one of the more absurd things of this absurd match. Again, like an undying zombie, Foley gets back up like the Terminator. They wrestle again some more. We see the thumbtack spots, which, even though it's been done to death now, it was the first time this happened in WWE. After all of that, none of that kills him. Undertaker hits the tombstone, gets the win with the tombstone, and thus we have one of the great matches in WWE history, WWF history, wrestling history. This match was everything it's been said to be, everything it's been hyped up to be afterwards. It is one of the best matches as far as story-wise, as far as violence-wise, as far as just utter craziness. The levels that these two men were willing to take, and specifically Mick Foley, and don't get me wrong, Undertaker went through a lot here because he was working this match with a broken ankle. The amount they were willing to give to entertain us, the fans, and it kind of chokes me up just thinking about that. It was just so crazy, and this was one of the greatest things in my opinion. It's one of my favorite things that's ever happened in wrestling. I absolutely love this. I know I said we do a 1 to 5 scale in the beginning, and I've done this before, so if you've been a viewer for a while, you know that every now and again I'll break my own scale, much like Dave Meltzer does. My ratings are a little bit different than his. His are very rigid, mine are more entertainment-wise. I gotta say, this is above and beyond what you would consider a 5. I don't even know if I feel comfortable giving it a rating just because of the significance of this match. I gotta be honest with you guys, I gotta give it a 10. It's twice as good as pretty much anything you're gonna see on any other show. Just fantastic, historically significant, legacy building, one of the great matches in the history of WWE. One of the reasons why WWE was able to catch up and retake the lead over WCW. Just a fantastic match. Now, how do you follow that up? You really can't. But they did have a main event to go to for the WWF Championship. Steve Austin versus Kane in a First Blood match. One of the problems with having an epic, genre-changing, business-changing, iconic match not be the main event is people forget about the main event. Kind of similar to WrestleMania 18, where Hogan and The Rock wrestled before Triple H and Chris Jericho. No one really remembers what a good match Triple H and Jericho had because it's overshadowed by Hogan and The Rock, much like here. No one remembers what was a really good match between Kane and Steve Austin, but it's overshadowed by the Hell in a Cell, and rightfully so. I mean, if you ask Kane and you ask Steve Austin, they'd probably tell you that Hell in a Cell definitely deserves its rating and deserves to be as talked about as what it is. This is a really fun match. We see Mick Foley come out and get involved. Again, how the heck is he even walking? Undertaker gets involved again. This is really fun. Ultimately, Kane picks up the win when he busts Steve Austin open on the head, thus winning the WWF Championship, a reign that unfortunately was only 1 day long. I thought this was a really good main event. Hard act to follow, but I'm giving this a 4. Overall, let's be honest, this card is remembered for one thing and one thing only, and that's the Hell in a Cell match. I do recommend going back and watching some of the other matches, XPac and Owen Hart, Kane and Austin, the main event. The rest of the show, pretty skippable. I gotta take that into account when I give this its overall rating, because for the most of this, I was kinda indifferent. This felt like any of the era's pay-per-views. It felt like any Monday Night Raw in the era, any SmackDown in the era, other than that one epic match. So how do I fairly rate it? Do I consider the match elevating the card? Does the card bring down the match? I don't know. In my opinion, I definitely say go back and watch this. If for nothing else, skip till you get to those 3 matches I mentioned. But it's worth the watch. And definitely, I recommend every wrestling fan, if you've seen this before or haven't, going back and watching it again, because it's worth it. I gotta give the show a 5, to be honest with you. It has one of the most iconic matches in the history of wrestling that I can't talk about enough. There's not enough hyperbole to say how great that match is. Just for that, it gives the show a 5. With all that being said, I know we probably have a long video here, especially how long I went over the match itself. But if you made it here, thank you first of all. Second, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you're not subscribed. And if you see where it says join, that's how you become a member. Becoming a member definitely helps out the channel. If you made it all the way to the end, let's throw a Mick Foley in the comments. You gotta give the guy respect. Even if he's not one of your favorites, you gotta respect everything he's done for wrestling. Just one of the greats. He's my absolute favorite, so I definitely respect him. With that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another It Came From The Network.